Hey, 42 here. In November 1922, Howard Carter came upon the final resting place of a little-known Egyptian pharaoh, known as Tutankhamun. When Carter carefully removed the outer door and stepped over the threshold, he became the first human being to do so in well over 3,000 years. Though Carter didn't know it at the time, Tutankhamun's tomb was to become one of the greatest archaeological finds in the history of mankind. Right up there with the Terracotta Army, the remains of Pompeii, and the Rosetta Stone. News of the incredible discovery hit the headlines as the attention of the world's media trained itself squarely on the Valley of the Kings in Egypt, near to what was once Thebes. It was the crowning achievement of Carter's career, something that would see him immortalized amongst archaeologists. But from the moment he first stepped inside the pharaoh's tomb, rumors began to spread that his actions had unleashed a terrible curse. Punishment from beyond the grave that would be dished out to all of those who had dared disturb the long-dead pharaoh. Plenty of people thought it was nonsense, including Carter himself. But then, quite suddenly, people started dying. A few months before this remarkable moment in the history of archaeology, Howard Carter found himself standing in Downton Abbey. Well, sort of. The Grand Manor House was actually called Highclere Castle, and it was home to the 5th Earl of Carnarvon, rather than the 7th Earl of Grantham. But 88 years later, it would be selected to serve as the home of the fictional Crawley family in everyone's favourite period drama. Which is actually pretty apt because, as it happened, Carter found himself at the centre of his own little drama that day in 1922. You see, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon was his benefactor, the man who'd been financing Carter's archaeological expeditions in the Valley of the Kings for the previous 7 years, during which time Carter had turned up next to nothing of archaeological interest. Admittedly, the outbreak of the First World War had somewhat hampered his efforts, but that didn't change the fact that Carnarvon had invested a lot of time and money into the venture in return for diddly squat. Well, I say diddly squat. Carter's years in Egypt had yielded a few odds and ends, scraps of linen and shards of pottery mostly. It wasn't much, but many of these items shared something strange in common. They were inscribed with a single word, the name of an Egyptian pharaoh whose remains had never been located: Tutankhamun. You don't need the powers of a pharaoh to preserve your hair and keep it healthy. All you need is Keeps, who've kindly sponsored this video. I've had people close to me start to lose their hair as early as their 20s, and it's always been an upsetting experience. If you're in the same boat, then you're not alone. Did you know 2 out of 3 guys will experience some form of male pattern baldness by the time they're 35? But the best thing you can do to prevent hair loss is take the initiative now and do something about it whilst you've still got hair left. I really like Keeps because it makes treatment super easy by delivering your hair loss medication every 3 months, so you can say goodbye to awkward doctor visits and waiting in pharmacy checkout lines. There's a reason that Keeps has more 5-star reviews than any of its competitors, and hundreds of thousands of men trust them for their hair loss prevention medication. If you're like me, you're probably not ready to lose hair just yet. But prevention is key. The faster you act, the faster you see results, and the sooner you start using Keeps, the more hair you'll save. So if you're noticing that you're losing your hair, do something about it. For a limited time, go to keeps.com/42 or click the link in the description to receive 50% off your first order. As far as Carter was concerned, it was proof he was close, but Lord Carnarvon had asked Carter to join him at Highclere Castle to tell him it was over, that he would no longer be financing digs in the Valley of the Kings. Carter was almost frantic, practically begging Carnarvon to give him more time, and that show of passion paid off, because Carter came away with a deal: 1 more year. If he didn't uncover anything of note in that time, his funding would be cut and all of his hard work over the years would have been for nothing. As it turned out, Carter wouldn't need anywhere close to a year. He resumed his search for the tomb of Tutankhamun on November 1st, 1922. And 3 days later, he found it. The team was going over old ground near the previously discovered tomb of Ramesses VI when one of Carter's men stumbled over a large piece of rock. Being a former archaeological dig site, there was plenty of rubble lying around, but unlike the rest of the loose rocks, this particular chunk was partially buried beneath sand and mud. It turned out to be the top of a very long staircase that disappeared beneath the ground until it ended abruptly, right at the door of Tutankhamun's tomb. Carter called for Lord Carnarvon at once, and when the Earl arrived, the two men got a front row seat at the opening of what was basically the world's most exciting unit on Storage Wars. But unlike Storage Wars, Tutankhamun's tomb wasn't full of soiled mattresses and 80s pornography. No, it was packed almost to bursting with around 5,000 priceless artifacts, including a dismantled chariot, finely carved figurines, priceless jewelry, ancient weapons, and one standard issue Egyptian mummy, ensconced in no fewer than 3 nested sarcophagi, the last of which was made of solid gold. Somewhat ironically, considering the almost immediate rockstar status Tutankhamun enjoyed around the world off the back of this rediscovery of his mummified body, he wasn't actually all that important in his own time, at least as far as pharaohs go. And whilst he would become famous for unleashing a curse on the men who found him, it seems the boy king, who was only 19 when he died, may have suffered from a curse all of his own. A cripplingly small gene pool. If you've watched my video on the dangers of inbreeding, you'll know making babies with close family members is a bad idea. And not just because of the funny looks you'll get at the hospital. Unfortunately for King Tut, his parents, apparently, hadn't watched my video on inbreeding, because they were siblings. If only they'd subscribed to the channel. Anyway, as a result of this rather unfortunate brother-on-sister action, Tutankhamun was born with a wide range of both physical and mental disabilities. Perhaps that's why he was pissed off enough to unleash a deadly curse when his not-so-eternal slumber was shattered 3,500 years later. Randomly enough, the first life snuffed out by the curse of Tutankhamun, taken on the very day the tomb was discovered, was that of Howard Carter's canary. It was stationed in a birdcage hanging outside his door, and its untimely demise served as an appropriate warning of the danger that was about to come. It was a messenger boy who stumbled across the grisly scene. Coiled in on itself inside Carter's birdcage was a huge cobra, the cage's previous occupant hanging from its mouth. Efforts were made to save the poor bird, but by the time the alarm was raised, the canary had already passed on to a better place. Well, the cobra's small intestine. It was a creepy event, made even creepier by the all-too-obvious connection to the recently opened tomb. You see, that very same day, the team had found 2 statues guarding the entrance to a still-sealed chamber within the tomb, thought to hold the pharaoh's sarcophagus. The statues were large and imposing, depicting Tutankhamun himself, and each wore a golden crown adorned with a uraeus. That's the ancient Egyptian symbol of divine authority. And it just so happens to be in the shape of a cobra. As far as omens went, it was a bad one. But Carter and his men were made of stern stuff. After all, you don't get a grave-digging gig in Egypt by being superstitious. The group were a little shaken, but whilst a few whispered about a possible curse, most were certain it was just an unfortunate coincidence. And a coincidence it may well have been, but that didn't save Lord Carnarvon. It started with nothing more than a mosquito bite on the Earl's cheek, a few months after the discovery of the tomb. It was a small wound, the kind we've all experienced on a warm summer's evening. Itchy and annoying, but no big deal. Lord Carnarvon probably thought the same. But when he nicked that very same spot while shaving later that evening, he opened up the wound just enough to let the blood start seeping out and infection creep in. He was dead from blood poisoning within 2 weeks, a little more than 4 months after becoming one of the very first people to step foot inside Tutankhamun's tomb. In another spooky coincidence, when the pharaoh's body was first examined during an autopsy 6 months later, a strange lesion, just like an insect bite, was found on its cheek. At this point, people started to take notice. At 56, Lord Carnarvon was not a particularly old man, and his death from what seemed to be a minor injury was unsettling. Those first whispers of bad omens and curses that had started after the incident with the Cobra soon became full-blown rumors of an ancient and terrible curse that made headlines in newspapers around the world. And the deaths just kept on coming. In May 1923, financier George J. Gold succumbed to the effects of a fever he'd contracted whilst in Egypt. He'd begun to show symptoms of illness not long after visiting the newly discovered tomb of one Tutankhamun. A man called Arthur Mace was next, dead from arsenic poisoning in 1928. He'd been an important member of Carter's excavation team. Carter's secretary died a year after that, smothered in his sleep in a posh club in Mayfair by an assailant who was never caught. As those connected to Carter and the excavation continued to drop like flies, people began to speculate as to just what was behind the deaths. The papers spoke of a written curse scrawled across the wall of Tutankhamun's tomb in weathered hieroglyphics. Death shall come on swift wings to him who disturbs the peace of the king. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, author of the Sherlock Holmes mysteries, had his own theory, suggesting invisible elemental guards left to defend the long-dead pharaoh might have been responsible. Whatever it was, it seems as though Carter and his team were being targeted by something. So, what became of Howard Carter himself? The man who discovered the tomb in the first place, and ultimately the person responsible for disturbing the pharaoh's peace. What terrible fate did the curse have in store for him? Hodgkin's lymphoma, which killed him at the age of 64, a good 16 years after he first entered Tutankhamun's tomb. Okay, yeah, that does kind of mess with the whole curse angle a bit, doesn't it? And now I come to think about it, he wasn't the only one to escape the mummy's wrath by living to a ripe old age and dying of natural causes. In fact, of the 58 people known to have been present when the tomb was first opened, only 8 died within the following 12 years, and one study by well-known scourge of the paranormal James Randi found that those supposedly struck by the full force of the curse survived, on average, for 23 years after the tomb was discovered. Okay, so maybe that's because there was only so much of the curse to go around. A bit like a supernatural version of a poisoned mousetrap. Deadly, but it could only take so many victims before it ran out. That could be it. Or, you know, the whole cursed tomb thing could just be one gigantic pile of ancient Egyptian camel shit. Just a thought. As it turns out, there's actually a pretty straightforward explanation for the curse of Tutankhamun. One that doesn't require any hocus pocus, threatening hieroglyphics, or any of those invisible elemental sentinels Conan Doyle suggested were guarding the tomb. Although on that last one, I must admit, I do kind of love the irony of an author still famous today for creating one of the most ruthlessly logical characters ever to grace popular culture was himself an absolute Fruit Loop. Anyway, before Lord Carnarvon sadly passed away, he'd been a pretty astute businessman. He'd sunken a huge amount of cash into his search for the tomb of Tutankhamun over many years. So, when he finally found the damn thing, he wanted to make a little return on his investment. And the first way to do that was to sign an exclusive contract with the Times newspaper back in England for rights to report on the excavation. Times journalists were allowed to access the tomb, and the pictures and articles they printed had their newspapers flying off the shelves back home. Having been entirely denied access to the site, the other newspapers had nothing to print about the remarkable events taking place in the Valley of the Kings. And so they did what newspapers always do when they have nothing genuine to report on. They made something up. While some Egyptian tombs did indeed have curses scribbled on their walls and entranceways, King Tut's tomb wasn't one of them. That apparent curse, reported in some newspapers about death and swift wings and all of that nonsense, was simply made up, most likely by some journalist with aspirations of becoming a horror writer. Basically, the curse sold papers, and so the press kept hyping it up every chance they got. After that, the whole thing was mostly just confirmation bias. A few of those involved with the excavation did indeed die, some in unusual circumstances. But most didn't. Take any large event in history, and you'll probably find at least a handful of those attending kicked the bucket not long afterwards. Lord Carnarvon's was arguably the only somewhat unusual death, coming as it did so soon after the discovery was made. But in reality, there was nothing mysterious about his demise. You see, back in 1903, he'd been involved in a bad car accident, and his health had never really recovered. In fact, the only reason he got interested in Egyptian tombs in the first place was thanks to his doctor's advice to dodge winters in Downton by jetting off someplace warm on account of his poor health. That warm place ended up being Egypt, and Carnarvon became fascinated by the local culture, a passion which eventually led to his patronage of Howard Carter. Carnarvon was killed by a mosquito bite simply because his immune system was weak to begin with, and he wasn't able to fight off the ensuing infection. As for the mark they found on the mummy's face that seemed to correspond to the bite, it was just a coincidence. And besides, it seemed nobody could quite remember whether it was actually on the same cheek as the bite that did it for Lord Carnarvon. And since he'd already been dead half a year when they discovered it, there was no way to actually find out. So, could there have been a curse lurking in the tomb of Tutankhamun? Well, never say never, but, no, absolutely not. But before I go, I can tell you about a real cursed tomb, if you like. You know, just so you don't feel shortchanged. This grumpy-looking chap is Casimir IV, who was Grand Duke of Lithuania and King of Poland during the 15th century. He died in 1492, the same year Columbus discovered the New World for Europe, and he was laid to rest beneath Warel Castle in Krakow, where he was to remain undisturbed for 481 years. It was a team of scientists who broke that peace when they were permitted to enter the tomb to examine the ancient king's remains. As well as having a good poke around, they had plans to restore the crypt to its former glory. But they would never get the chance. Because, whilst old Casimir may not have achieved the same fame as a certain ancient Egyptian pharaoh, he really knew how to do a good curse. Of the 12 scientists to enter the tomb, 4 were dead within the week. And the rest didn't hold out much longer. 10 died prematurely in all, and of the 2 that survived, 1 suffered serious health problems for the rest of his life. Now that's how you do a cursed tomb. Textbook stuff, Casimir. Although, I'm afraid once again the reality here probably doesn't quite live up to your expectations. Because while Casimir's tomb absolutely did contain a curse, there was nothing supernatural about it. No. This curse was something scientists could capture and study. Something to which they gave a name. And that name was Aspergillus flavus, a type of fungus that produces aflatoxins, which can prove fatal to humans when inhaled or ingested. The deadly fungus was grown unhindered in the rotten wood of the king's coffin for almost 500 years. When the scientists entered the tomb, disturbing the air just enough to release a cloud of lethal spores all around them in the process. So remember, curses may not really exist, but killer mushrooms certainly do. Thanks for watching. Thanks again to THEBES for sponsoring this video. Don't forget to try it out using the link below.